What, can I talk to you a minute?
Yo lo quiero con mi corazón.
Yeah, I know you love your boss.
Aunque está poquito gordiflón.
You finished, Pat.
Yo lo quiero con mi corazón.
Yeah, now look, you know there's a strike
A
in the
mí
area?
me trajo desde Nuevo León.
Mexico, huh?
Y me trajo a mí en un camión.
Came in a truck.
Jale ya no había en Nuevo León.
Starting in the 1940s, the United States relied heavily on immigrant farm workers to produce large quantities of produce for the American public. This is a story of a nonviolent civil rights movement of those immigrant farm workers in Central California during the 1960s, and especially the events in and around Delano, California. The picketers involved in the Delano Farmworkers Strike were mostly immigrants from Mexico and the Philippines, who labored in the vineyards of Central California. In the 50s and 60s, migrant farm workers in California were paid unfair wages, around 90 cents an hour. They worked from sunrise to sunset. Farm workers had few or no breaks and sometimes even had to pay for a sip of water, sharing a single cup. Growers tended to be racist and often had little to no respect for the immigrant laborers. These conditions were a result of the backfiring of the Bracero Program. The Bracero Program, established in 1942, was an agreement and a series of laws put in place between the U.S. and a Mexican farm group that was supposed to guarantee decent living conditions, sanitation, adequate shelter and food, and a minimum wage of 30 cents an hour. But that was in the 1940s, when 30 cents was somewhat reasonable. By the 1960s, when wages were 90 cents an hour, farm workers really struggled to survive off what they earned.
And it's not just a question of wages, it's a question of housing, it's a question of education, it's a question of living conditions, it's a basic question of hope for the future.
Well, when I became ill from picking fruit and parathine taken me to the hospital, and Alma's unconscious. Stayed there 9 days.
These awful conditions led to a number of walkouts. The first, in Delano, was led by Larry Itliong, a Filipino immigrant who became a leader of the farm workers movement, though now somewhat forgotten. The Filipino farm workers walked out on September 8, 1965, beginning a 5-year civil rights movement. 2 workers' groups joined forces for the strike: the Agriculture Workers Organizing Committee, led by Larry Itliong, and the largely Latino group, the National Farm Workers Association, led by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. Both the Filipinos and Mexicans went on strike for improved working conditions and better pay. The solidarity for the strikers was very important. They need to be strong against the growers and remain nonviolent.
The fruit and the vegetables got there because someone was exploited. They're subjected to the sun and to the heat and to the cold and to pesticide poisoning. They're treated like animals. And they endure all the sacrifices and all the suffering so you can eat and I can eat. These men and women and children feed all of us, and they don't have any food for themselves, and we're going to change it.
We are waiting for you. You are earning more money today because the workers here were not on strike on September.
Over time, Cesar Chavez became a leader of the farm workers movement, guided by a strong belief in nonviolence and admiration for Gandhi and Martin Luther King's way of leading. The strikers went to the fields to urge other farm workers to join the strike. In some cases, this was very successful, but often the owners used violence. The police were even involved, and many of the picketers went to jail, despite how all of them remained nonviolent.
If I have reason to believe that there's going to be a riot started and somebody tells me that there's going to be trouble if you don't stop them, then it's my duty to stop them.
Well, then you go out and arrest them?
Well, absolutely.
And charge them?
Charge them.
What do you charge them with?
Violating unlawful assemblage.
Well, I think that's the most interesting. Who told you that they're going to riot?
The men right out in the field that they were talking to said, if you don't get them out of here, we're going to cut their hearts out. So rather than let them get cut, you remove the cause.
How can you go arrest somebody if they haven't violated the law?
They're ready to violate the law. In other words,
could I suggest in the interim period of time, in the luncheon period of time, that the sheriff and the district attorney read the Constitution of the United States?
The UFW started a nationwide boycott of California grapes, after members of the strike traveled all around North America campaigning for both financial support and exposing the conditions that the farm workers had to endure. Although the movement was known by everyone, their fight for a better life was not over. The strike was very difficult for many of the farm workers. They needed money to support their families and didn't know how long the movement would last. Some of the farm workers had to leave the strike and return to the fields. Led by Cesar Chavez, the members and supporters of the UFW marched 300 miles from Delano to Sacramento. They walked through several farming towns and were joined by local farm workers who left the fields. In February of 1968, Cesar Chavez called out the growers by going on a hunger strike. His reasons for fasting was to spread awareness about the violence that the striking farm workers were facing. Although not all members of the union would agree with his decision to put his health in danger, Chavez knew that fasting was a very effective way to get the growers' attention. He was so successful that Martin Luther King wrote to him in support. The UFW put pressure on the growers to sign union contracts, and in 1970 the growers caved. After 5 years of the strike, the farm workers gained safer working conditions, better hours, fair pay, and respect from the farm owners. In the 1970s, Delano and many other farming towns in California had union hiring halls, a health clinic, a health plan, a credit union, and a community center. Several farms were eventually owned by the migrant farm workers. This limited the amount of discrimination and abuse of power. The triumph of migrant farm workers successfully striking for 5 years, gaining support for their grape boycott from the entire country, and getting the growers to sign union contracts came only after decades of tragic exploitation and because of the strikers' nonviolence and solidarity. This story shows the importance of immigrants in producing the food that the American people eat every day. It sheds light on how immigrants were being taken advantage of, and it proves that they are capable of fighting for their rights.
Pues el pueblo ya está en contra de los rancheros y engreídos que acababan con la gente. Y como somos hermanos, la alegría compartimos con todos los campesinos. ¡Viva la revolución! ¡Viva nuestra asociación! ¡Viva huelga en general!